I'm Lexi Keough. I'm the executive director of Project Knitwell, and I want to just thank you all for being here today. 15 years ago, Carol Caparosa sat in a hospital room knitting during her daughter's heart surgery. That simple act of knitting really provided comfort to her during an incredibly difficult time and inspired her to share that gift with others. In 2010, she started Project Knitwell. Today, and we've grown from just that one volunteer in one location to over 50 volunteers at over 30 sites who have taught over 8,000 people how to knit, which is just amazing to think about. And that's really provided comfort, community, and resilience to those facing life's toughest challenges. Today, we're here to celebrate this journey and learn from three world-class experts about the power of knitting. I wanted to thank them for joining and thank you all for joining and for supporting our mission. So before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. Um, we are going to be recording the sessions today, and the video will be emailed to everybody next week. Please use the chat window to submit questions for the speakers. We've got everybody on mute to make the recording a little more smooth. So just go ahead and use the chat for your questions, and I'll ask them during the end of each speaker's presentation. And if you do happen to have audio or video problems, just try leaving and coming back. Usually that sorts out a lot of the Zoom problems that people have. But to start the program today, I'd like to introduce Carol Caparosa.
Thank you, Lexi. Good
Yeah.
morning. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for being here to celebrate 15 years of meaningful and powerful work. When I started Project Knitwell, I didn't know how long it would last, how many people we would teach, how many volunteers or project sites we would have, or research that we might contribute to. But I knew that it was important to begin. And I knew it needed to be guided by three core principles. Those principles are defined in our tagline, which is knitting with a purpose, wellness, comfort, and community. I wanted everything that Project Knitwell did to promote wellness, to create a feeling of comfort, and to build a sense of belonging, a community. And I wanted that to happen with the people we provided our services to, and for the people who provided the services, our volunteers and staff, who are the backbone of Project Knitwell. This organization would not exist without our dedicated volunteers, some of whom have been with us for almost 15 years. The seed for Project Knitwell, as Lexi said, was planted many years ago as a result of a very personal and stressful experience I had when my daughter was born. Many of you know my story, but I wanted to briefly recall it for those who may not know it. My daughter, Emily, was born in 1990 and came home as a healthy newborn. But at 7 days old, she was rushed to the hospital and diagnosed with multiple congenital heart defects. Her first surgery was the next day at 8 days old. While I was in the hospital with her in those early days, I felt really helpless. I mostly just worried and paced. That is, until I found knitting again. That simple act helped me get through those very long and difficult days. I felt calmer. And I didn't know it was the knitting that was causing me to feel calmer, but I know now that that was definitely the reason. Years later, I went back to volunteer on the same pediatric unit where Emily had been treated, and I saw mothers who looked as scared and as worried as I had. I started to teach them to knit, and it was clear from their words and faces that the knitting was helping them. I kept hearing the same words over and over. They would say, "I feel calmer. I'm less stressed. I'm feeling productive. I'm proud of myself." It was then that I began the steps necessary to start Project Knitwell. And I just want to take you back briefly 15 years ago and tell you why I chose those words, wellness, comfort, and community. Everyone on this call knows that the activity of knitting is therapeutic. But beyond the therapeutic aspects, the wellness word to me meant that we would find the best way to teach knitting. We would not make it more confusing or complicated than it needed to be. We were already working with people who were navigating complicated situations. Project Knitwell wasn't going to add to that. So we simplified our instruction. We created easy starter kits. The yarn was already cast on for the participants. And we offered simple patterns and resources so a project could be finished, leading to a sense of accomplishment. We would train our volunteers to become not expert knitters, but expert instructors. When I first started looking for volunteers, I wasn't looking for people who were advanced knitters. I was looking for people who could learn to teach knitting to people in difficult situations. And I need to add that our volunteers are much more than knitting instructors. In my mind, they are foremost helpers. They understand they are supporting individuals in challenging moments. The next word is comfort. Comfort to me meant creating an experience that felt gentle and supportive from the way we teach, the patterns we offer, and the materials we provide. I wanted Project Knitwell to use beautiful yarns that would feel good in the participants' hands or around their necks. And when working with mothers in the NICU, we would provide yarn that was soft for the babies and be practical, would be washable and dryable. We would provide a sense of comfort and ease. From wellness and comfort, I believe community would follow, our third core principle. The communities would start within the places where we were teaching, the hospitals, schools, homeless shelters, etc. And then they would expand out to the local communities through yarn stores, knitting guilds, etc. And then, of course, there's the whole social media platforms where knitters from around the world can find each other. I have known mothers who wouldn't leave their child's room, but would come out for the knitting class. And I had Spanish-speaking moms in the pediatric ICU help me teach other Spanish-speaking moms. Later, I saw those women become friends and help each other, not just with their knitting, but with the ups and downs of having a child in the hospital. As a side note, we now have our instructional booklets in both English and Spanish. And I often get emails from people I've worked with years ago who tell me that they started a knitting group at their workplace or in their neighborhood. So the work that Project Knitwell does has a ripple effect. It continues to grow long after our volunteers are directly involved. To me, that's lasting impact. And as I reflect on these last 15 years, I can confidently say that these principles still guide us today, and they're as relevant as ever. I recently learned that a mother I worked with in the NICU with twins no longer knits, but she keeps the baby hats she made in the hospital on her desk as a reminder that she can do hard things. I know others I have worked with only knit when they're feeling stressed or are back in the hospital for treatment. To me, those are Project Knitwell success stories. Success for Project Knitwell isn't measured by creating lifelong knitters or advanced knitters, though that's wonderful when that happens. It's about meeting people where they are and offering support when they need it the most. That could mean a finished hat, or it might mean a moment of calm in the chaos of a hospital unit. In closing, Project Knitwell began from a place of fear and isolation and has grown into something that truly promotes wellness, provides comfort, and builds community. I look forward to many more celebrations honoring the work and the wonderful people who make up Project Knitwell. Thank you for being here to celebrate. I will now turn it back over to Lexi, who will introduce our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Carol. Our first speaker is Dr. Mia Hobbs. Dr. Hobbs is a clinical psychologist who works primarily with children, young people, and their families in West London. She is passionate about letting more people know about the therapeutic benefits of knitting at her website, therapeuticknitting.org, and as the host of the Why I Knit podcast. She's part of the team at Creative Restoration, which offers courses, webinars, and workshops that guide participants through different aspects of knitting for wellness. And as just a side note, a group of volunteers and staff here at Project Knitwell participated in her self-care one stitch at a time audio class. And it was a really, really great way for us together to look at how we can take care of ourselves as we are doing this work ourselves. So I just wanted to thank her so much for giving us that gift, and welcome, Dr. Hobbs.
Thank you very much, Lexi. Thank you, Carol. Nice to see you again. Carol has been a guest on the podcast in the past. So my name is Dr. Mia Hobbs. So if we just move on to the next slide, just to explain a little bit about who I am. So I'm a clinical psychologist based in London in the UK. I specialise in working with teenagers and their families, and I have in the last few years started to use knitting as a therapeutic tool, which has been really interesting, and have had some amazing moments of kind of engagement and therapeutic change as a result of bringing knitting into the therapy room. I'm also involved in supervising research in knitting and mental health, and I host the Why I Knit podcast, which is about why we knit and how knitting benefits our mental health. And as part of creative restoration, we apply our knowledge as clinical psychologists. So that's work I do alongside my colleague, Dr. Paula Redmond, to how and why knitting benefits our mental health. And we do speaking engagements, and we've got webinars, and we also do a journal club on the podcast feed as well. If we move on to the next slide. So I've been asked today to talk about community in knitting, and I guess I wanted to set that in the context of how we think about knitting. And I guess our lens specifically as clinical psychologists is focused on knitting and mental well-being. So we've created this diagram to try and summarize some of the main themes that arise in the research and in our podcast interviews. So we've now done more than 60 podcast interviews. So it's just kind of summarize some of the main themes that come up again and again about knitting and mental health. And social connection, which I suppose my interpretation of that is kind of community, is one of those. And you can see it appears in this diagram on the working yarn. So just to explain, we've separated it out into how and why. So on the knitting needles in this diagram, we've got the why. So these are the features of knitting that get mentioned time and time again as to why knitting is a really great tool for our mental health. So if we look at those features on those knitting needles, knitting allows us to create something useful. It's relatively accessible. Most of us can learn to knit relatively easily. It's portable, unlike many other similar crafts, and it's diverse. I suppose by that we mean you could knit something very simple in garter stitch, or you could do some super complicated color work or brioche, and knitting has got you covered. I've done more than 60 interviews and I haven't yet met someone who feels like they've completed all there is to learn or to explore from knitting, which is amazing. Knitting is also gives us something tangible, unlike much of our digital world at the moment. And it's low stakes, so it's kind of an environment where we can try things out and make mistakes. We can mainly do it on our own, and we can unravel it if it goes wrong. It's also incremental, and that is really important for me as a psychologist, and I'm sure also for Project Knitwell. If we're meeting people at a time when things are really hard in their life, they might not be able to do a lot of something, and it might feel quite overwhelming. They might not have much time or emotional, psychological bandwidth. So the idea of doing something in small increments is really helps it feel achievable. In terms of how knitting benefits our mental health, we've summarized the main themes that arise in the research and in the podcast interviews into two categories, really. So they are that knitting soothes us and that it has this drive quality, so kind of energizing things. So in terms of the soothing, people talk about knitting calming their body, so making them feel more relaxed, to being like meditation, that it gives them a calmer mind because it allows them to focus in this mindful way on this simple action, and it allows them to access self-compassion. And in terms of drive, knitting gives us a sense of accomplishment, and it's really great that that's tangible. We can see it and touch it, show somebody else. It allows us to access this sense of play. There's lots of sensory aspects to knitting in terms of the colour and the physical sensation, and it gives us a vehicle for self-expression. And social connection on the working yarn in this diagram is linked to both of those, and it's a really important feature that comes up in most of the research in knitting and mental health. So we're just going to have a look on the next slide at some of the main research studies, so we can learn what does the research tell us about knitting and community. So if we start on the top left of the slide, Riley et al. 2013, that's a study that Betts and Corkhill was involved in, and it was a large-scale survey of knitters focused on kind of emotional and social well-being, and they found that knitting in a group was associated with greater happiness, confidence, and communication. So that was an important finding about this kind of how this community element of knitting brings us well-being benefits. If we look at the Nordstrand study from 2024, that was a study specifically using a Ravelry group of people who identified as having mental illness, and they analysed how people talked about knitting benefiting their mental health. And this had an interesting finding that said that socializing behind the needles can facilitate and regulate social contact, both in person and online. So it was a study that highlighted that not everybody can access in-person knitting groups, but the online community of knitting can also be valuable. And the other thing is that not only just facilitating social contact, but having a way of regulating it. And that was really important. So whereas often we think about, more social contact as being better, this was actually more nuanced. It was that participants found that actually sometimes knitting allowed social contact or allowed them to be in social situations in a more manageable way so that they could kind of join in a way that worked for them, or that they could reduce the social demand of the setting. So that, I think, was really important, because not more social contact isn't always better. It's the right kind of social contact for our needs. So I think that was a really important finding. If we now go over to the right-hand side, La Lagadec, that was a scoping review about needlecraft more generally. And they looked at lots of different studies about needlecraft and mental health. And one of the main themes were about social connection, that needlecraft brought social connection and a sense of value and belonging. And the final one of these studies, Burns and Van der Meer, is about crochet. So respondents said that they made new friends through crochet and found it easier to talk to other people who crocheted and felt less lonely. So those are some of the kind of important findings in the research about the kind of community social connection aspect of knitting and crochet and mental health. If we go on to the next slide. So I wanted to highlight a few quotes from the podcast. So these are all from the Why I Knit podcast, and they talk about this idea of social connection and community in knitting, but in very different ways. So I suppose one of the things I sometimes feel like community through knitting is something I've been less good at, because I guess I've been in a phase of my life as a knitter where it hasn't been very easy for me to access in-person knitting groups. My kids have been kind of young and need a lot of care, and I also work, and it's difficult to kind of access where I live a regular knitting space. But that doesn't mean I haven't been able to access community through knitting. I think it just means that actually that's more nuanced than just sitting in a room with people and knitting. So Susie Bass is somebody who's doing a PhD in knitting and mental health, but also has talked about kind of using knitting to cope with trauma. So she's somebody who's been to knitting groups at difficult times in her life. So this was what Susie had to say about it. She said, you have all of these struggles going on, and you can sit with some people and craft, and you can maybe share or maybe not share anything, and just get lost in a moment where all that matters is what you're doing in that moment. And I think this is something that comes up often on the podcast, specifically when we're talking about grief, that often grief is a type of distress where talking is only so helpful. It doesn't change what's happened. It doesn't change the loss. And sometimes it can feel kind of tiring, but that knitting is something you can do companionably in a room with other people, where you don't necessarily feel a need to talk, but that you experience the kind of community and companionship anyway, and you can feel like you're doing something when there isn't really anything to do about the distress. So that was something about an in-person knitting group. If we move on to the next slide. So this is another aspect of community that's come up a lot in the podcast. So at the end of every podcast interview, I ask, what's the biggest gift knitting has given you for the rest of your life? Roz is somebody who has struggled with chronic illness and has been bedbound for many years. And she spoke about the online community and knitting. So Roz said, the biggest gift is the community, the understanding of how important it is, how even from bed, I can take an active part in that community. I gain so much from it, and I do my best to give back to it. So I think there are lots of people who are attracted to knitting because it's something they can do from bed. And the fact that we now live in a world where you can connect with other knitters online has meant that she's been able to feel this sense of community through her knitting. We go on to the next slide. So Nasreen talks about kind of the kind of social connection across the generations, and also a common theme which has come up as to using knitting to connect with lost loved ones. So Nasreen sadly lost her mum, I think, when she was about 6, and her mum was somebody who did a lot of crochet. So Nasreen said, I guess that's how my relationship with craft started. I was trying to connect with my mum's memory and what she did. And then obviously moving into kind of connecting with myself and then connecting with other people through the web. And then finding a different way to connect with my children and passing that on to them. So this gives us this kind of sense of this intergenerational sense of community and social connection. If we go on to the next slide. Oh, sorry, this one slightly got messed up in transfer to PowerPoint. So this is Sylvia Watts-Cherry, who you might know as a knitwear designer. So Sylvia was born in West Africa and she then moved to Scotland. She now lives in the south of England. And Sylvia's talking about this idea of connection and community and using knitting as a vehicle for understanding all those different parts of her heritage and upbringing. So Sylvia says, I think connection has been an important thing for me, connecting to others, feeling as part of a group. That's always been a thread that's gone through my life. And it's through the knitting I'm coming to finally accept my differences and also accept that I'm unique and have many influences. And that's what makes me who I am. And I can rejoice in all of it and I don't have to hide any of it. And this is a way of celebrating it all. So that's really a kind of her using knitting as a knitwear designer to celebrate all of her different aspects of her heritage. If we move on to the next slide. So this is all about the different ways that knitting can kind of facilitate social connections in our lives. So if we start at the top, pink, the fostering belonging. So that was something Sylvia talked about, this idea of the kind of accessing different communities and feeling a part of something. You know, that's something that's important in Project Knitwell too. So if we go round clockwise, access to new communities, many of us are kind of living in communities where we're defined by our kind of roles in our family, like by being parents or by our jobs. And knitting gives us an opportunity to connect with different people outside of that. And I know that was a wonderful thing when I interviewed Lauren Brennan from Project Knitwell when we first connected as part of the podcast. We realised we'd knitted several of the same patterns and we actually did a little knit along after we stayed in touch. And that was amazing that she lives on a different continent to me, but we could have this connection through knitting. Learning from each other, that's something that emerges in the research, the idea of people who are able to knit in person can have, you know, report having greater confidence and trying new things because they can learn from other people and feel more confident to try things out. Connecting to previous generations, that was something that came up in Nasreen's quote, but it's something that comes up very often, having kind of intergenerational connections through knitting. I know it's something that happens in my family. It's something we enjoy across 3 generations of sharing our knitting projects together. Maintaining connection after loss, that's been a theme that has come out of some research I'm supervising, looking into the data from the podcast interviews. This has been a really important way that people feel this social connection through knitting to connect with lost loved ones. Nurturing relationships through gifts. That is something that doesn't even require the other person you're connecting with to be a knitter, but that you could use knitting as a vehicle for maintaining social connection. So for me, that was really important in the pandemic. I have a group of friends who I trained with as a psychologist, and we meet up every January. And in 2021, we were not able to do our usual annual meetup. And I was really missing that group of friends. So I knitted them each a hat that I could send to them as a way of maintaining our connection. Connecting to cultural and historical traditions, that's something that's important for many of us in keeping going with knitting. And we know that the study that Betson Corkhill did suggests that our mood, the effects of knitting in a group can boost our mood. We can also experience community solidarity through knitting. Knitting is a great way of us connecting to our values. You know, we can get involved in organisations that are in line with our values or are doing things that are important to us. And we can kind of demonstrate that. And we know that there's a greater association with well-being when you're living a life in line with your values, and also combating loneliness. So those are lots of different ways that knitting can bring social connection and community into our lives. We go on to the next slide, please. So we know there are really robust links between social connections and mental health. So knitting, as we talked about previously, can make social connection more accessible for many of us. So knitting can be a reason to meet people. It can give us a really defined thing to talk about. It can mean that we've got a reduced requirement for eye contact, and certainly when I introduce knitting into the therapy room, I really feel like I see the body language of my clients change. We often sit next to each other so that I can teach them how to knit, and that feels more comfortable. I work mainly with teenagers who feel very comfortable in a kind of position of being a learner. And we've got this kind of shared topic of conversation. So we can do some problem focused talk, and then if they're finding that difficult, they can ask me a question about the knitting, and we can kind of regulate how much of the problem focused talk that they're helpful with. We know that increased social support can reduce social isolation, and that this social connection can be a buffer against stress. So social connection can improve our coping capacity, can provide us with a source of emotional validation, can give us access to practical help, and can activate our soothing systems. So all of those are really helpful with managing stress. We go on to the next slide. I just wanted to end with talking a little bit about our work and how we create community in our work. And I suppose I see that on many different levels. So if we start at the bottom of this pyramid with the Why I Knit podcast, this is the way we've shared stories on the podcast of knitters about how knitting can benefit our mental health. And I get emails very often from people who listen to the podcast. You know, we've had more than, I think, 200,000 downloads. So lots of people really connect with this idea. And this, I think I get lots of messages from people who say this has really allowed me to lean into using knitting as a valid strategy. I can really see it as something that they kind of knew it felt important, but they didn't really feel legitimate in seeing it as a, you know, a part of their mental health strategy, like maybe we do now with exercise. Lots of us accept that that is, you know, can be really important for our mental health. So I think it's created a community of people who feel that they connect to those stories. If we move up the pyramid, we've aimed to kind of inform and empower people. So we've created a community of knitting who feel passionately about using knitting as a tool for their mental well-being. And by offering webinars and the kind of journal club episodes of our podcast, we've given them a way of being more informed about how to do that intentionally. As part of our work, we also love to support facilitators. So as Lexi mentioned, you know, Project Knitwell have used our self-care one stitch at a time course, but we also are in touch with other therapists, people working in education, other charities, and they use our content to inform their work. And they go out into their own communities and are informed by this using a kind of mental health and self-care lens to access knitting. And they take that into their own communities and create communities there. And also on a one-to-one level in the therapy room, I often find that by introducing knitting as part of therapy, I'm passing on a skill to my clients, which opens up new social connections for them and access to different communities. So often that's, you know, having a conversation with their grandparent who might be a knitter, or finding a friend at school that they now develop a new connection with who also knits or crochets. So just to end with the last slide, just to tell you a little bit, if you want to find out more about our work, our website is creativerestoration.org. You can find the podcast and our webinars and the self-care one stitch at a time course there. We also have a monthly newsletter where we summarize all of the things we've been doing, and also kind of research or kind of news articles about knitting and mental health there.
Thank you so much, Mia. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
It's wonderful. We had a couple of questions come in over the chat, and I'm sorry that we don't have more time for questions, but I'll give you one really quickly here. Are there any research projects in the works that you are especially excited about in this type of research about knitting?
Yes. So I'm supervising two pieces of research that I'm excited about. So one of those is analysing data from the podcast, so looking at people with experience of psychological distress specifically, and analysing the kind of themes that have come out of that on the podcast. So that's a really exciting piece of research that's very nearly finished. And also going to be supervising another piece of research, which is focusing more on people with ADHD and how they use knitting and their experiences of that, because there have been a couple of studies published recently that were really exciting that have looked at knitting and how it's impacted kind of attention and focus and responses on attention and focus tests. So this is a bit more about a qualitative view on that. So those are things that I'm really excited about. But, you know, I'm always excited, yeah, about new areas of research and, yeah, keen to be involved in that. And we're, you know, our journal club on the podcast is a way of kind of encouraging other people to learn a bit more about what the research is telling us.
Thanks. And just one more question. Um, do you know of other psychologists who are using knitting in their work with clients one-on-one?
Yes, there are. So there are certainly therapists of different kind of different types of therapists, like with different backgrounds who've been in touch with me. I've sometimes offer supervision in terms of thinking about that. So it's really great to make links with other therapists. And we're very much using it as kind of a tool within therapy. So there are lots of my clients who are not interested in knitting necessarily, but we will often have a conversation about what it is about knitting that's helpful and help them to think about something else that maybe is more accessible for them that they could use that might serve the same purpose. So often it's a kind of start of a conversation. But actually, I've had some really amazing kind of developments in therapy as a result of using knitting. So it's definitely something that's exciting to explore more.
Well, thank you so much for sharing part of your day with us. Really, really appreciate it. And look forward to hearing more from you. Your newsletter is great. I encourage everybody to sign up for it.
Thanks.
Yes. So on to our next speaker, Dr. Perri Klass. Um, Dr. Klass is a pediatrician and a professor at New York University. She writes the checkup column for the New York Times and serves as national medical director of Reach Out and Read, a group that works on literacy. And she has also written a number of books on a wide variety of topics. I encourage you to check out her list of publications. And she brings a really unique perspective on the intersection of medicine and knitting. So I hope you can all welcome Dr. Klass. And just as a reminder, please put any questions you have into the chat, and then I can ask her when we get to our next question and answer session. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so honored and delighted to be here, and congratulations on the anniversary and on all of the wonderful work. I'm going to take you on a slightly different route into hospitals and the medical world, and take you also on a personal journey through knitting and writing. So I will say to you that probably, as in other stories people have heard, I was taught to knit as a child by my grandmother. And it was something that I knew how to do. It was not tremendously important in my life until I found myself in the early 1980s going to medical school. Now, I went to medical school in what we now often refer to as the bad old days. And what that means is that for the first 2 years of medical school, really what happened is that I and my 120 or so classmates showed up every morning at 8, and we sat down in a large amphitheater, and various people came and lectured to us from 8 till 5. And we tried to write down everything they said, and they told us not to do that. We were given printed lecture notes. We were just supposed to listen and learn and understand. And what I learned very quickly about myself was that I'm not really good at sitting still from 8 to 5, listening to whoever happens to be on the schedule talking about whatever very important subject. And yet at the same time, it was medical school. It was important. You sat there thinking to yourself, what if the day that I drift off into some unrelated memory or fantasy or just take a little snooze is the day that they're teaching me something that someday is going to really matter? And what I discovered was that I listen much better when I'm knitting. I listen much, much better when my hands are moving. And I didn't know this because up till then, when I'd taken courses, courses I'd chosen because I was particularly interested in them. And here it was, all day, every day, and I really felt like I needed to listen. And I discovered that I could listen if I was knitting. So I wasn't the only one. It wasn't an original idea. There were a couple other people who would knit in class, and it really worked. And as I went through medical school, I relied on this, especially in lectures and conferences, and I learned what kind of knitting I could do while listening. It had to be certain kinds of simple. I couldn't be checking a pattern every row. I couldn't be following something complicated. But I found it really, really helpful. What I found interesting about it was that there were people, especially among my teachers, who objected. And at one point, I had a student stop mid-lecture and kind of yell at me because I was, knitting. And I thought, of course, I had all these brilliant responses, none of which I said, about how, you were just talking about restoring the dexterity, the muscles, the nerves. Here I am demonstrating it, but I just put away my knitting and kept quiet. Anyway, and this continued to be true in many ways when I was a intern and a resident in pediatrics in Boston at Children's Hospital. And again, it was the bad old days. We didn't get a lot of sleep. And then they would sit us down and they would give us very, very important lectures that were obviously relevant to taking care of our patients, and we would all go right to sleep. And again, I found that if I brought my knitting, and again, I was, looking at other residents who did this. If I brought my knitting, I could stay awake and I could listen. And there was something supremely comforting, even if you were listening to a lecture about bad things that could happen, bad outcomes, scary diseases, that to actually be sitting there and knitting did a couple of things. And I thought, Dr. Hobbs' talk was wonderful, and she spelled out some of those things. It made me feel connected to the people I was knitting for. I might add that I had my first child when I was in my second year of medical school. And so when I was sitting in the hospital, I would be making something for my son, and I would be feeling connected and feeling happy. Anyway, well, the first real story I wanted to tell you is I write a lot about medicine and about my experiences. There used to be a regular column in the New York Times called the Hers column, which I had written mostly about medicine and various topics, including crying in the hospital and doing things for the first time. And I kept saying to the editor, I'd like to write about knitting in the hospital. And the editor kept saying to me, and you have to remember, this is the 1980s and the 1990s. There were not that many women in medicine. It was not uncommon to find yourself the only woman on a medical team, although less so in pediatrics, but certainly so in surgery. But anyway, I kept saying to the editor, I want to write about knitting in the hospital. And she kept saying to me, that's kind of I don't want this to be the women's pages, in quotes. And I kept saying, please let me write about knitting in the hospital. I promise it will be controversial. I promise you'll get letters. And finally in 1991, and I was still a fellow, I was in training, medical training lasts forever. She let me do it. And I'd written an awful lot of columns. I'd written a lot about medical training. This was the column that I most enjoyed writing, that I was proudest of publishing, and that I would say it was published in 1991. So that's a long time ago. It is the single column which people still show me that they carry in their wallets, folded many times, that their mothers sent them, that their daughters sent them. It's probably the column I still hear about the most. And what I said in it was that for me, the index of professional success will be so successful, so important, that I can knit at work and no one can tell me not to. And it was my ambition working in the medical environment to grow up to be the person who could knit no matter what. And I wrote about the the feeling of knitting and why it works for me and why it comforts me and why it soothes me. And I also got to tell the story of, sitting in clinic when there were no patients there and I was getting a little knitting done, and the clinic director told me that my knitting was very bad for morale and it would be much better if people saw me doing nothing than saw me knitting. And I said I put the knitting away and I did nothing. And I tried to write about the question of why does it bother people, doctors knitting in the hospital? Is it undoctorly in some way? Is it quote unquote female? I had written a lot about the question of, what doctors do and don't do. For example, in pediatrics, when I started my training, doctors did not change diapers. And I once wrote an essay about examining a baby who really needed his diaper changed, but the other people on my team kept saying, no, 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 let us do this, and then the nurse will change the diaper. It compromised our doctorly dignity. I think this has all changed a lot in the interim, and of course, there are a lot more women in medicine now, and I don't think that's unrelated. But at the time, there were people who were upset. Knitting in the hospital was not something a doctor should do. And I got to say in the New York Times, seen as a trivial activity, a time filler for people with nothing important to do, an intrusion from the womanly world of home and family. And in fact, in medicine, it is often better to do nothing in a frantically busy and self-important doctorly way than to do something non-doctorly, however constructive, however peaceful, and however comforting. And I kept coming back to this idea that it was somehow comforting. And that really got me started thinking about the role of knitting in the hospital, and the place where I encountered it most regularly. And I think, Carol, you mentioned this, was in the newborn intensive care unit, where you had these astonishingly competent, talented nurses who took care of these incredible, the tiniest, sickest kids in the hospital, often one-on-one. And they sat by those incubators, by those isolates, by those warming tables, and many of them used to knit at night, especially during the long hours. And when I worked in the newborn intensive care unit, we were, of course, as residents, very scared and very grateful for the nurses and very scared of the nurses because they knew so much more than we did. And I remember sort of feeling both comforted and reassured that there they were. And NICU nurses in pediatrics are famous for, quote unquote, having the best hands in the hospital. They take care of tiny babies. They can draw blood, start IVs in the veins so tiny that the surgeons can't see them. And we all knew this. We knew these were people whose hands were magic. And I remember sitting there watching them knit at night as they kept their babies company. And again, thinking about the various ways in which this felt connected in what was otherwise a place that was very scary for parents and even for young doctors in training. And that became one of my major images of knitting in the hospital. And as I say, I began to understand that it was also a way of bringing the people I loved with me to work and thinking about them, and that it was for me much more than just this keeps me awake and I can listen and that will help me memorize these important bits of information, even if it had sort of started out as a strategy. Now, I have to tell you that at some point, somebody said to me, I was sort of talking about being able to listen better if I was knitting, and somebody said to me, of course, you're a kinesthetic learner. Now, I had never heard of kinesthetic learners, but in medicine, it's always better if there is a multisyllabic name, technical term for what you are. And I then felt, oh, of course, I'm a kinesthetic learner. It makes sense. And, the next surgeon who yells at me, I'm going to say, excuse me, I'm a kinesthetic learner. But it made me start thinking about the different parts of the brain and what we do and don't understand about the neurology of knitting and why it works. You've just heard Dr. Hobbs talk about some of the studies on knitting and social connection. connection. There are also fascinating stories on knitting and memory, both in people who are losing some of their memory for one reason or another, but are able to retain so when you think about knitting, you already heard my cause in pediatrics is early literacy. And there's a connection in that for a child to learn to read, there's not one reading network in the brain. You've got to be able to use the visual networks. You've got to be able to hear the sound, see the letters, hear the sounds. There's the handling the book skills, which are very different in a 6-month-old, a 1-year-old, and a 2-year-old. Knitting is like that too. It uses both of your hemispheres in your brain. It requires motor skills, as we know. It requires spatial skills. It requires visual skills. It requires pattern recognition and memory in all of those different areas. And interestingly, many people, first of all, some people who are struggling with memory loss retain the memory that they need for knitting. And it seems possible, plausible, evidence-based that for at least some people, that exercise using those neurological networks and connections actually helps them retain their memory. It's a beautiful exercise for the brain while also doing providing the social functions and all of the connection that we've been talking about. So I just wanted to say a word for the complexity of the neurologic knitting network in your brain and the ways that it's been and is being studied for the ways that it helps you integrate all of those different skills, which obviously also connects to the ways that children, especially in an increasingly digital world, can learn skills ranging from pattern recognition to dexterity to different kinds of memory by engaging with the real analog world and knitting. So let me move to my next slide and tell you one more story. As you heard in the introduction, I for years have written advice. I've written about knitting, but these are the chance to write about knitting in places where the audience is not expected all to be knitters. And for years, I wrote a parenting column in the New York Times about a whole range of, what does it mean when your child has a stomach ache? What does it mean if your child is still wetting the bed? And I would call experts and I would interview them and I would talk about them. And one of the things that I found repeatedly difficult about this was people would post online comments, and many of the comments were, I thought, kind of frighteningly judgmental. It's the parent's fault. If the child eats too much, if the child doesn't eat too much, it's the parent's fault. The parent's doing it wrong. And it felt a little to me like whatever parents did was wrong. That is to say, some people would be writing in to say, it's these parents today, they're hovering too much and they're spoiling their children. And then at the same time, people would be writing in to say, if those parents would only put down their own cell phones and pay attention to their children. And it almost didn't matter what the topic was. I wrote about babies crying on airplanes. People wrote in to say, it's all the parents' fault. Of course, it's not the parents' fault. I've been a parent with a baby on an airplane. I wrote a column saying they cry on airplanes because they're babies and they're on airplanes. And if, when we're on airplanes and we don't want to be there, we'd cry too. And it's not, but the level of willingness to judge people. And I started to think about how when you look on a knitting website, when you go on Ravelry, basically you either compliment something, you say that's amazing, I love that, or you move on to something else. You don't look at the work that other people have done, the things that they're proud of, the things that they love in the knitting world, in order to say, well, I would never take that color, or I would never. You appreciate, you understand that people make lots of choices, that not everybody has the same aesthetic. And if you're going to comment, I see someone saying some people do, but actually when I was writing this column, I interviewed some of the people who manage the comments and the boards at the knitting websites, and it's really not very common. There are people who write in very angrily if they feel that a pattern is problematic or harder than it's supposed to be, or, didn't work. But it's not that common to feel that you need to tell someone, you really blew it here when you went for that, dark green because it just doesn't show the stitch pattern. It's not that common. Whereas in the world where you write about parenting, it is almost a majority people. And the reason I thought this was important was because when we talk about people who are parents today, especially young parents, they do feel very judged and they do feel very anxious and they live in a world in which they feel they're being commented on. So I actually wrote about the public shaming that goes on about being a parent. And I asked the question, is it possible that knitting makes us nicer? While child rearing maybe makes at least some of us crankier and more critical. And I was so irritated by the judgmental comments that I basically said in the column, all of these people should learn to knit. Um, can I have the next slide? And then finally, I'll make one more jump, which was, as Dr. Hobbs also talked about, and what happened during COVID, and the ways that people who, including me, who were deprived of much of our usual contact, who were anxious in different ways, the different ways that knitting figured into that. And I think for me, and I did a lot of online knitting groups and was there because I wrote about this, was then invited to speak in various other online groups, a number of which were knitting for others, knitting, baby hats for the NICU, knitting for charity. And the themes that kept emerging were, first of all, that knitting helped us through the moments. It helped us through those anxious moments, those moments that we had too much of. And I said in the column, and this is, I guess, what I've come to understand about myself, I am so terrible at mindfulness. I do not do meditation. The same thing happens as when I try to listen to a lecture. Knitting is the only thing which really brings me into the moment so that I am there, so that I get through the moment, so that I experience the texture and the time. And I talked about being aware of the tension, given that tension has a technical meaning in knitting, but it's also got, I think, a certain metaphorical importance. And that at the same time, then during those interesting, complicated, hard COVID months, that it was bringing us into the moment and bringing us together, it was also connecting us back to the world, that I would think about the person for whom I was knitting. And even if we weren't able to travel or see each other as much, that I would think about the trips where starting the scarf on a family car trip to New Hampshire. Someday we'll do that again, about choosing the yarn, about the future occasions when we would see each other. And that I think that combination of connection to the moment, being in the moment, together with the connection to the past and the future, together with the community of other people knitting on their screens, knitting for the people in their lives or the people who would benefit from the gift, and getting through those moments together, feeling those tactile sensations, using our hands in a world where everything had become pictures on a screen. And it also seemed like a pledge to the world that we would get to have again someday, and the ways we would renew those connections, and the ways we would have stayed connected during this hard time. So I think I'm at the time now, if there are questions. I'm again really delighted to be here. For me, writing about knitting, and especially writing about knitting for other knitters, has always been a way. I wrote about my father, I wrote about my mother. It's always been my favorite way to think about the connections and the ways that, I wrote about the beautiful sweater I was going to make for my father, but then he died. So what I have is the sweater I made for him when I was in eighth or ninth grade, which he was very nice about. He even tried to wear it. I wrote about knitting as a way of connecting to family members, but also as a way for me of being not just in the world at home, but also in the professional world in the hospital. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Klass. Really, really appreciate it. I had a question for you really quickly. Um, I was just wondering, through your work, your literacy work, as well as other work, as a pediatrician, you spent a lot of time thinking about child development and wellness, and I was wondering if how you see activities like knitting or other hands-on creative things that people do fitting into our broader understanding of health and well-being, especially when it comes to children.
Well, first of all, ch all children everywhere need activities now that don't involve screens much more than they ever did. I think the fear of what we may be losing, sometimes because screen time is displacing other activities, but sometimes just because children aren't getting the chance to explore the world in the same way. I think it's tremendously important. I think we again understand I think there for children. I think I think Dr. Hobbs mentioned children with ADHD. I think those who are kinesthetic learners, those who need some motor element, those who need some kind of repetitious activity. I think it can be life-changing. And I also generally think that, in a world that's as digital as ours, one of the things we owe children is a chance to find out all the different things they can actually do with their hands, make with their hands. And, that yes, I know there's always a program that can make your comic book look professional, but if you actually draw it yourself, if you actually manipulate the crayons or the colored pencils, if you actually use your hands, if you actually knit, if you actually paint, if you actually build something, we all know that's, tremendously important, both for neurologic development, for integrating all those networks, but also for that harder to measure creativity, and also for teaching you that actually you can engage your mind and um, let time pass in a useful, interesting way that you've chosen.
I had one last question for you, because you have quite a few fans of your writing in the chat. There was a question if you have any other books, or any other writing coming soon.
Oh, I hope so, but I working actually on a book about reading and small children growing up with books. So that will probably be the next thing.
Well, very excellent. We really appreciate you coming today, and thank you so much for sharing your
Thank
experiences with
you.
us. Thank you.
Thank
Okay. Um, we're moving on to our last speaker, and that will be Carson Demers. He is a physical therapist with 30 years of experience, and he's the author of, I'm sure a lot of you know, of Knitting Comfortably, the ergonomics of hand knitting. And he teaches fiber enthusiasts across the globe how to practice their crafts safely and comfortably for life. And I am going to stop sharing my screen and let him share his screen, and then he can get going.
Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
Carson.
Thank you. Thank you, Lexi. Thank you, Project Knitwell and Carol. This is such an honor, and it's such an honor to share the dais with Doctors Klass and Hobbs. I have broken from my routine of having PowerPoint because I know that we have a limited time and I talk too much. So I I have notes in front of that I'm reading, and you're just stuck with my mug this morning. I wanted to just start by sharing a little bit about me and why I do this work. I learned to knit as a child. Um, I started as a crocheter, which I think a lot of people do, but I will tell you that being a boy in the 1960s and early 1970s, knitting was not something that you talked about very much. And the whole it was kind of done in the secret. So fast forward, um, I've been a knitter ever since then, and I became a PT in the 90s. And um, about 10 years into my career, I got very bad ergonomics related injuries due to faulty office ergonomics. And I will just share with you that when, in the 1990s, if you think about what um, office furniture looked like and what digital equipment looked like, it's very different than we have today. We have so much more adjustability and customizability in our seating and in our chairs, I'm sorry, our tables and monitors that go up and down and all that stuff. And I worked in healthcare. So we, especially at the manager level, we were the last to get any of the fancy stuff. So it was, a cafeteria chair and a metal desk that was too high or whatever it might have been. Anyway, my point is that I got very badly injured with you name it, carpal tunnel, cubital tunnel, ulnar neuritis, cervical disc issues, shoulder issues. It was profound and it was terrifying because number one, I couldn't treat patients. I couldn't use my hands to do that. And number two, I couldn't knit. Now, I will. I hope none of you have had this experience, but when you are a knitter and you're told that you can't knit, I always used to tell my doctors, we are people with um, a need to move our hands and an arsenal of sharp weapons at our disposal. So please make sure we can keep going. And so it was 2 years of rehab for me. And during that time, I started using knitting as a means to get me well again. And it actually works so well in a physical rehab situation because it is very incremental. There's a lot of stuff that you can variables that you can play around with, including weight and diameter of needles and just all kinds of things that you can do with it. And so I felt very fortunate that I was able to bring this into my practice. I did return to practice and left management for good, and it was a great thing because it was just for all the reasons that we've heard about. It was a way to connect in a different way with patients, and it was a way to get them engaged in their physical rehab that was probably going to be more successful and certainly more compliant than if I just gave them a list of exercises to do. I do want to just say, first of all, how wonderful it was to hear all the comments or the information from Doctors Hobbs and Dr. Klass this morning, and they just absolutely were so reinforcing to, I think, things that I believe about knitting. One of the community connections that I love about knitting, or one of the actual things about knitting and knitted fabric for me, is that it is a tangible manifestation of community across generations. Just as rows of knitting build on one another, we build on those generations of knitters, what they've learned, what they've passed on. It connects with those who taught us to knit. It connects us with those who we get to teach to knit. And it really is an exchange of energy between your hands and what's going into the fabric that you're creating. And it's based on the energy exchanges that have been happening for generations. And I just find that so nurturing and comforting. And it's why knitting is my very, very happy place. So that being said, there is a reality to being a knitter, which is that we are of flesh and blood. And because of that, we have the susceptibility for things to go awry. So I'd like to just start by saying a little bit about what ergonomics is. I'm going to give you like a very high level what ergonomics is, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that you can do to help you along. So at the highest level, ergonomics looks for a way to create an environment that is fitted to the user, providing you with a comfortable space. That word comfortable is key, in which you can work while maintaining the highest level of productivity, efficiency, and safety. So if you think for a moment, I want to go back to this word comfort. If you think for a moment about what you do when you're in an uncomfortable environment. Now, it might be that the room is too cold, so you'll put on a sweater, or it might be that the room is too dark and you'll switch on a light, or it might be that there's some sort of emotional or psychological discomfort. Maybe you're, I don't know, maybe you're at a party and there's someone there that you don't particularly want to party with. You might do whatever you can to not sit at the table next to that person, or the shoes that you bought on Saturday worn to work on Monday are finally pinching your feet and you just can't wait to take them off and put on your comfortable sneakers that you have under your desk. So comfort is a really, really big deal for us. And I think that when people talk about ergonomics, the first thing that they think of is safety, comfort and safety. How am I not going to get injured? But I want you to know that it goes beyond that. I do a lot of teaching about how can we, in the goal of keeping you safe and comfortable, how can we also make you a more efficient knitter and a more productive knitter? And I'll say a little bit more about what that means in my work in just a second. Now, this idea of comfort is hugely important, and I hope, again, this applies to none of you. I have known so many knitters over the years. I've been teaching ergonomics now for almost 20 years to knitters, who will, despite having numb hands, despite having burning elbows and carpal tunnel syndromes, will continue to sit there and work on their project. They will say, one more row, which is the great knitter's lie, right? We all know that there's no such thing as one more row. That one more row is going to turn into, oh, I'm 2 rows from the end of this repeat, or if I go 4 rows, I can switch colors, and wouldn't it be nice to see what that purple is going to look like here? So one more row is really a signal from your brain that your body is tired. And it's your brain saying in your body, it's a signal from your body saying that you are tired. And it's your brain saying, oh, come on, this is much more interesting. Now, I used to kind of joke about this with my students, and I don't anymore. And again, I'm so grateful to the words of the other 2 speakers, because it absolutely reinforces my belief, which is that we get a level of comfort from knitting that is so valuable that it surpasses physical discomfort for most of us. Now, this has made my work really hard, because I have to be the parent and say, no, it is bedtime. You need to stop. You need to, and the reason is, and take it from me because it happened to me, if you get injured, it's very hard to come back. It can be very hard. And for many knitters, it's very scary to come back. I had a doctor who was in one of my classes, and she was a radiologist, really kind of intense job, lots of computer stuff, and knitting had always been her thing. But for the last, I think she said it was probably about 2 years, she couldn't knit comfortably. And so she came to me and we did some work together, and it was a technique issue that she was having. She had this chronic tendonitis in her elbow, and she just couldn't figure out where it was coming from. And, as a PT, I was able to kind of suss that out for her and kind of quickly. But she was on the brink of not being able to knit again. In fact, her words to me were, "You're my only hope. You're my last chance. And if I can't do this, I don't know how I'm going to continue being a radiologist." No pressure at all. Let me just get right on that. But fortunately, it was a very easy fix. And I wish I had the swatch. I do have swatches from her that she made, that she knit comfortably. And, it was such a happy story. So my job is to help you guys stay in the knitting business for the long haul. I'm sorry here, I'm just jumping on. I got ahead of myself here. So let's talk a little bit about the knitters who came before us, because they have a great impact on where we are today. pre-industrial revolution knitters didn't knit for the same reasons that we do. I think that many knitters from that time, if they were, first of all, if they could be on this kind of a Zoom situation, they would be freaked out. But to hear us talking about knitting community and to be talking about all the wonderful psychological benefits, physical benefits of knitting, they had a very different take on it. Their take on it was, I do this for money, I do this for income. My croft makes socks. In addition to all the other things we do to keep this farm running, we make socks and we take them down to the dock when the ships come in and we sell our socks. That's what we do. And we knit all the time. And we knit in ways that allow us to do that, allow us to tend the fields and to do all these other kinds of things. Because they were doing this for income, this work had to be safe work. There was no workers' comp for them to fall back on if they got hurt and couldn't hold the needles. They had some very specific conditions that made this work for them, which is number one, they knit a very small array of patterns and a very limited stitch palette. If you look at traditional Shetland knitting, even Farrell knitting today, there is rarely a purl stitch, and before the Industrial Revolution, you wouldn't see them at all. Everything was knitted. There were no purl stitches. Why? Because the purl stitch is very fiddly. You all know that. Ergonomically, it is a more challenging stitch to do. It requires different movements that aren't conducive with the general flow of things. So they could be very, very fast. They also worked with a single breed of wool. You didn't have the luxury of going into a yarn shop and choosing 100 different kinds of wool and plant fibers and cashmere and all these other kinds of fibers that we have available. A single kind of yarn construction and a single kind of very simple needle that got the job done for them. So what happened? Why don't we work like this anymore? This set of conditions, from my ergonomics perspective, it's a perfect example of a perfect ergonomic system. These knitters could work efficiently. They work very safely, although there's, you're not going to find much literature on injury rates among, 18th century Shetland knitters. I'll tell you that. That's a niche that I don't think anybody's tapped into. But they had to do it. So they found a very efficient way to knit. They found ways to make this work. And it did for generations and generations. And then along came the Industrial Revolution. And suddenly socks could be cranked out on a machine, sold for much less money. They were certainly less interesting. Men stopped wearing colored socks. Did you know that? Men stopped wearing colored socks with the advent of the sock knitting machine. They only knit them in either white or black. There you go. But before that, you would get lovely colored socks. And so, boo. Thank goodness was it Queen Elizabeth who was adamant about not changing up the sock industry very much. So anyway, we lost, because people moved off the farm and into factory, we lost that connection, that intergenerational connection of training future knitters. And it was a serious thing for knitters that I don't know that we pay enough attention to in terms of our knitting history. And what brought knitting sort of back into the fold is that when people who had time to sit down and knit, and time and money to do this, in other words, if you were a factory worker and working probably 10 or 12 hours a day, you were not going to go home and do a project. I mean, there was life to do. The same kind of situation, same kind of challenges that working parents face today, right? That's what was going on. So those people who were able to knit were people who had time and money. And when this happened, it was done by the sort of gentrified people, the more social elite people. I always think of the Downton Abbey set, where Maggie Smith might sit down and have a salon with other needlework peoples, and this was the beginning of the needlework. What's the word I'm looking for? Circles, right? So the needle circles, needle societies coming together and knitting. Now, one of the things that was unique about this social group is that they had very strict etiquette on the way a woman could hold or could use her hands. And one of the things that was very verboten was for a woman to show the palm of her hand. So, whereas pre-industrial revolution knitters would have a belt or a sheath and hold their hands, and I'm not sure if you can see my hands because I'm not seeing myself, but could hold their hands in a very neutral position, they needed to show the backs of their hands. They stopped wearing knitting sheaths, knitting belts or sheaths, something that would hold a needle, and went to holding the needles as if they were pencils. And this changed absolutely everything for them. Knitting became slower. It became much more movement intensive. And it sort of evolved into what I call today's knitters is a sort of hybridized knitter, where we use some of these techniques across the tradition. So not just English knitting, but also in continental knitting, similar things were happening on the continent. But we lost these traditional needle holds. We lost the traditional ways of teaching things. There's nothing like sitting beside an experienced knitter and learning from them. You can read all the books you want, you can watch all the YouTube videos, but when you're sitting next to an experienced knitter, you learn a lot. So everybody needs to go to Shetland and sit down with experienced knitters there, and go to Norway and sit down with experienced knitters there. It will really change things. So when we started to perceive knitting as a leisure activity, one of the things that I think happened for us is we fell into this mindset of, this is a hobby, this is a craft, nothing bad can happen to me here. And I can just knit and knit and knit for hours. I wish that were true, but the fact of the matter is that knitting is an exchange of energy. Your body is expending energy to handle the yarn, to manage the energy in your yarn. And yes, yarn has energy in it. The fibers have unique properties that give them varying amounts of energy. You certainly know this if you've ever knitted wool versus cotton versus linen versus raw silk. These fibers have different fiber requirements that you have to put into it. Handling the needles, handling the yarn on the needles, making needle choices that are appropriate or not. So today we have all these different fibers that our knitting ancestors didn't have. We have all sorts of yarn constructions, and we have lots of different needle materials, more than ever before. And while that's a wonderful thing, I remind us that we are living in a capitalist society, and the makers of these products want to sell you products. And you may not understand the ergonomics of this product. As a matter of fact, I do a full day class on knitting needles, just all about needles and how to choose them and what each of the materials is like and the constructions and blah, blah, blah. And in doing that, in preparing for that class, I contacted many, many, many needle makers to get class support. And my first question to them is, can you describe for me what's the ergonomic advantage of your needle? And it was a field of crickets. Most of them had no idea. And when I look at what's in the market today, some of the newer products that are coming out, what sells, folks? This is what sells needles. Shiny, different looking. Shiny and different looking. So we also live in a time when we have lots of superwash yarn because, our eyes like those bright colors. So superwash yarn is very slippery. Shiny needles are often very slippery, those nickel-plated needles. And so I will tell you this as an anecdotal fact, which is the number one cause of discomfort that I see among my students for the last 18 years is that they've paired the wrong needle to the yarn, and it's such a fight to keep the stitches on, and it impacts all of our posture. So we're looking down so that we don't drop a stitch and miss it. We're pinching our work harder to keep it on the needles. And so just managing that pairing really makes a big difference in terms of neck comfort and hand comfort. The other reason that ergonomics is important to knitters today is that we live in the digital age, and that we experience, as a result of that, the same postures and the same muscle activities that are used in knitting to operate our digital devices. So if you think about what you're posture is when you're at a computer. You're usually seated, hips and knees are flexed, shoulders are slightly flexed and probably adducted. They're internally rotated to get you onto your keyboard. Same positions that you're probably in for knitting. So, and we often do this in a chair that's not appropriate for us, right? It's not adjusted unless you have an adjustable chair. But certainly when it comes to knitting, I would be surprised if you all told me that you had a chair that was designed specifically for knitting. I think most of us like to curl up on the couch or sit in front of the TV in a lounge chair and do our work there. But what you need to remember, what I want you to remember, is that knitting is work from the perspective of your body. So when you're knitting, you are having muscular contractions to do the work. You're having muscular contractions just to maintain the postures that you're in. It requires active contraction to internally rotate your shoulders. It requires active muscle contraction to have your elbows flexed. All of these activities are going on, and while that's happening, muscle physiology is happening. Muscle tissue breaks down, fibers break. They're called micro tears. It's nothing to worry about because we're designed to deal with that. But part of the dealing of that is for the tissue to repair, giving it adequate time and adequate hydration to do that. This process works best during sleep because our bodies are at rest. We're not moving around. And what the process involves is managing inflammation that comes from these muscle tears, these little muscle fiber tears. It takes about 7 or 8 hours for this process, and most of us, you've seen in the literature, are getting far fewer hours of sleep than 7 or 8 hours. And we're also living with higher stress levels. There's so much on cortisol that you'll see in the news these days that we're all living with this sort of amped up nervous system, and it makes it difficult for us to really heal this tissue properly. So my point here is that there are lots of physical challenges to us being a knitter. We're putting muscle energy into lots of activities that mimic or duplicate the movements of and postures of knitting. We're perhaps not making the best choices about chairs and putting our bodies to work in chairs that are not necessarily designed for us to be working from. And what that can all lead to is injury and fatigue and all of those kinds of things. So that sounds like a real bummer, doesn't it? So what's a knitter supposed to do about this? Well, I will share with you that when I first started teaching, it was a really hard sell to get people into a class about ergonomics because it just sounds so boring and dry and sciencey. And so I think people thought, oh, this is going to be really hard and it's going to be stuff that what am I going to do with this? Well, I want you to know that it's not any of that, and that what you can do is so easy, and that you can do the smallest of changes and get really big benefits from it. For example, one of the things that I talk about in some of my classes is the knitter's nest. And this relates to a knitter's idea of efficiency, where a knitter might think, well, I've had my stressful day. I'm going to go, I fed the family, dishes are done, all the other stuff you have to do. It's time for a little me time. I'm going to go park in front of the TV, probably in an upholstered chair that's probably really squishy and might have a high back, and it's probably low to the floor, and it's designed for binge watching Netflix shows, right? It's not designed for knitting. But I'm going to sit here and don't you bother me for the next 3 or 4 hours. I'm just going to park here because I need to get onto this part of my sweater. I need to finish this sleeve tonight. So we park in the knitter's nest, and next to the seat is, I call it Mount Yarn Olympus, where there's all the yarn that you could possibly need for the UFOs that are tucked under your bed and just haven't managed to deal with. And next to that, there's a table with every notion that you could possibly use in your project. You probably have your cup of tea or your Chardonnay or your whiskey sitting there. You might have a long-handled reacher to pick up that ball of yarn in case you drop it, or you've trained the retriever to bring it back for you so that you don't have to get out of the chair. Okay, so that's the knitter's nest. We sit there for these long periods of time thinking that it's an efficient way. Now, I will just point out very quickly that there is some folly in that pseudo logic, which is that when you sit down to knit, when you sit down at all, heart rate goes down, blood pressure goes down, respiratory rate goes down. All of this cardiovascular suppression means less perfusion to working tissue distally, so out in your fingertips, less circulation to your brain. You're just not getting as much oxygen because you're resting. That's what it's doing. Our ancestors didn't have this problem. You're hearing my dog who suspects that there's a bird out the window. I'm sorry if you're hearing him growl, that he's probably going to let out a bark in a second. My apologies. So sitting down in the short term makes us sitting down for long periods of time makes us more susceptible for these kinds of injuries. And when you do it in a chair that's not well fitted to you, it requires you to adapt your posture to working positions in the shape of a chair that's not conducive for that. So we engage more shoulder activity, which requires us to drop our head so that we can see what we need to see when we need to see it. It puts our backs in greater positions of greater pressure in the lumbar area as well. So lots of things happen by these choices. Now back to my story about the nest. I'd given the same story to a class, and I was doing a talk in a marketplace in Chicago, and across this really big marketplace, a voice said, "You should listen to what Carson says," which is terrifying. And but also, she came up and she said, "I made one change from Carson's class, and it was to break up my knitter's nest." And what I did was I put the remote control across the room. So if I wanted to mute the TV during the commercials, I had to get up and get it. And just by breaking up that 3 hours of knitting, she didn't knit less. She just broke up the sitting so that she was getting reduced exposure to bad postures and all those other things that I was talking to you about. So what can you do in the quick short term? Start with getting a chair that's better fit for working. I am sitting in an office chair, probably some of you are, and office chairs are designed for work. So I use my office chair for knitting and for spinning. I'm also a spinner. I have a little bit of a spinning wheel addiction, so there's about 7 or 8 of them around my house, and they're all different heights. And so my office chair works perfectly well. I can adjust for all those situations. I would encourage people to take breaks from sitting at least, now the research is going to tell you 20 to 25 minutes. I know knitters, and that's never going to happen. But I would ask you to please do it every 30 to 40 minutes, just to stand up for a moment. Thank you, Sarah. I love seeing what you're doing there. Stand up and do just what she's doing. Move your arms. Let your arms swing like pendulums. Let gravity help you to bring the circulation of the blood back into your hands. Open up your chest. Just get some oxygen into this tissue. I'm a big fan of what I call mindfulness markers in your project. And a mindfulness marker is simply a stitch marker that might look a little different than the ones that you have on in the rest of your project to count repeats or what have you. And what it means is when you come to this marker, I'm going to do X. I'm going to stand up and swing my arms. I'm going to put my knitting down and rest my eyes for a second. I'm going to have a glass of water. Whatever it is that will help to reinforce your knitting longevity, that's what the mindfulness marker is about. And what I encourage people to do is to have a list of things that you want to work on, these kinds of, shall I say, ergonomic things that you might want to work on, put them down and in a list, and then each time you come to this marker, let's say that you're doing a sock, you're going to hit it pretty quickly, do something different. You can also use the pattern that you're working with, and we're so lucky to have patterns because they have repeats, and so you can designate within your pattern that the row after all the cable crosses, where we've done a lot of difficult work, or maybe the row after the wrong side row of the cable crosses, where those stitches are a little bit tighter, my hands have done a lot of work here. So this is the time to set my work down, do some stretching, those kinds of things. Easy peasy things that you can do. I would encourage you to really listen to your body. And when it's saying just one more row, understand that your body is trying to tell you that it is tired and to respect that. It knows what's going on. Don't listen to those big frontal lobes of yours because they will keep you going and they want to be dazzled and excited all the time. Your body knows what it needs, and so listen to it. Another simple thing that you can do is to diversify your project work. And what I mean by that is um, diversify the kinds of stitches that you use. If you, for example, if you are a sock knitter and you only knit socks and you only use superwash self-striping yarn, it might be good for you because you have a high rate of exposure to all the risk factors that are involved in those kinds of projects and pairings. If you maybe knit at a larger gauge, maybe you do a boot sock and you work in a DK weight yarn and you do something that's not superwash. You work with different needles, experiment with needles. I can't stress this enough, to work with different kinds of needles so that you really appreciate the difference that needle materials bring to working with yarn, particularly in regard to managing friction or creating friction. I think we've been so worried about having too much friction between our yarn and our needles that we've swung the pendulum the opposite direction. And honestly, it's just made for sore arms, and my concern is sore necks because we spend a lot of time with our heads down already. Diversify your stitch patterns. Work some complicated stitches and some simple stitches. And it doesn't mean that within the same project necessarily. I hope that you are, what did we call this at my retreat? Polycraftorials, where you've got lots of different projects, different crafts that you're working on. So if you are doing that self-striping project in stockinette, set it down and work on a little cable something or other, or stand up and use your drop spindle or those kinds of things. Next level of things that you can do in the short term, please be mindful of conflicting activities. For example, if you're working with yarns that are difficult or stitch patterns that are difficult, you don't want to do that if your work requirements are having an increased demand for you to be on the computer using your mouse or learning a new software. My sort of classic example here is as we're approaching the end of tax season, the tax preparer who is working 14 hours a day and then wants to start knitting a cotton cabled sweater, which would be very hand intensive and problematic. So try to pair your activities when you're doing something that's hard and fine motor oriented at work or in other parts of your life. Do something simple in your knitting. I would also say, or encourage you to coordinate your exercise regime to complement your knitting activities. And what I mean by that is when we knit, most of the work is happening in our upper extremities. Obviously, if you're sitting to knit, which I encourage you to think about not having to do that, standing up. But we don't use our cores very much. And knitting has never been an aerobics activity. I mean, you might get a little sweaty if you're doing a tricky maneuver on your brioche repair or something, but it's not going to put you at your target heart rate and keep you there for 20 minutes. So think about pairing your activity, your exercise activity, to complement that. In periods of time when you are doing more knitting, maybe focus a little bit more on stretching, particularly hips and knees, anterior chest and forearms. Think about strengthening core muscles like abdominals, glutes, and hamstrings. And then the last thing that I will lead you with before questions, I hope I haven't run over my time, Lexi, forgot to set my timer, is an idea that I call the playground. And I would really encourage you to take this in. And I tell my students that as I've become of a certain age, and because I am from New England originally, I am at heart a curmudgeon. And so I find that every year I get a bigger soapbox to stand on and wag my finger. And this is my finger wagging for the last 5 years. How many of you know performance artists, actors, musicians, singers, dancers, athletes, first responders? The list goes on and on. surgeons, the list goes on and on. These are people who learn the basic of their art. They learn all the basic stuff. And then when it comes time to for a performance or a surgical case, they study that. They study that role. They study the surgical case. What specific things might I encounter here that I can pull from this body of knowledge, but that might be unique and not found there? How can I prepare for this to make it the best, to make it optimal? That's how artists work. That's how doctors work. That's how first responders work. Preparing for the unexpected. Knitters have a very different approach to their art. Knitters will go into the yarn shop and buy $300 worth of cashmere, and they will sit down with a complicated stitch pattern that they perhaps have never knit before, and they'll start working away on it, and they will be stressed the entire time because what if something goes wrong? What if I make a mistake with this? Oh, I'm not going to bother making a swatch because that yarn was too expensive. I'm not going to practice repairs because that yarn was expensive. So they will have this knitting experience where they are not as relaxed as they could be, where they're not breathing as well as they could be. There's a little bit of stress, or maybe a lot of stress that's involved in there. I know knitters don't like the word swatch, so I don't use it very much. And instead, I would like to invite you to create what I call your playground, because who doesn't like going to the playground? There's always a fun thing to do. It's all about experimentation with the world of physics and physicality and all those kinds of things. And the playground is a place that only you get to go. It's a place where there is no such thing as wrong. You cannot possibly fail in the playground. It's a magical place that I wish we could live in all the time. It's a place of learning and it's a place of experimentation. So in your playground, cast on, I don't know, 30 or 40 stitches and work on some of the techniques that you will need for this project. Practice that cable. I suggest doing this with a light colored worsted weight yarn. If your actual sweater is maybe fingering weight, and a fancy luxury yarn, do it with something that you don't have a lot of attachment to, any kind of emotional investment or financial investment in, so that you feel freed up to practice. While you're in there practicing these stitches, I encourage you to make mistakes on purpose so that you can see what it's like to fix them in an environment where there is nothing that can go wrong. Even if you can't figure out how to fix it, even if what you end up with is, well, if this happens, I'm really going to have to tear back, I'm going to have to frog, at least you know that. But I will bet that because you're all such smart knitters, you will be able to figure out that you can do that because the stakes will be low and your brain will be free to think it through. Use the playground to practice ergonomic improvements. Things like, in my playground, I'm going to practice standing up every 15 minutes or 10 minutes. You're probably not even going to spend that much time in there, or maybe I won't look down at my hands as much while I'm practicing knit stitches to save my neck because I've got a lot of phone work to do. Those kinds of habits can be developed in the playground. So I think that the playground is a place for us to use as rehearsal space. I think it's a place for us. You can think about it as a warm-up exercise before you start your actual project. If you were going to run a marathon, you're going to do some stretching and warm up before you start out on the trail. Think about your playground as the same kind of thing. Experiment in the playground with different chairs in your house to see if any of them give you better support. Even if it's not where you'd necessarily like to be sitting, you can deal with that problem later, but let's get you in the right seat. So I think that I'm probably at time and I will stop there, and I hope that this was useful information for you, and that some of it is stuff that will resonate and that you can find useful in your knitting practice.
Carson, thank you so much. It was so unbelievably helpful, and I loved how we got into our brains and our minds, and then we got to get back out into our body with you, and it was just a lovely talk, and it gave me so much to think about, especially as I think about teaching people. So, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Well, Big thanks to all of our speakers today. I just wanted to hand it off to close things up with to our board member, Keisha Evans-Philpott, and she'll bring it all home for us. Thanks, Keisha.
Hi. Hello, all. I'm so thankful for each of you for taking the time to be here with us today to celebrate Project Knitwell and the wellness, comfort, and community it has spread over the past 15 years and will continue to do so for many years to come. Dr. Hobbs, thank you for sharing your creative restoration and community benefits of knitting and your continued support of Project Knitwell. It is so good to be with you again. Dr. Klass, thank you for sharing your story and advocacy for the benefits of knitting. I am happy to share that I have brought my knitting to the corporate boardroom, and my CEO did not object. Carson, thank you for your work that will keep me healthy and knitting for years to come. I am adding a mindfulness marker right now after this call. And to Carol, thank you for finding me in the Georgetown NICU 14 years ago at the start of what would be a 5-month journey to bring my micro preemie home. Because of your belief in my ability to craft, which I vehemently denied, you provided me with a lifeline that sustained me as our son learned to live in this world and helped me heal from the post-traumatic stress syndrome that I didn't know I had. Knitting was the only thing I could do in the NICU. It grounded me through all the complications, heartbreaks, and joys, and to this day is an integral part of my life and a key part of my identity. I have become a knitter with a capital K. Project Knitwell transformed my life, and we hear other stories of lives touched through the intentional method of knitting Carol put in motion 15 years ago. Thank you again, Carol. Thank you to all the Project Knitwell volunteers, and thank you to all of you for supporting the work of Project Knitwell. What we do truly matters, especially in these difficult times. Together, we are transforming lives. So thank you. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and it's greatly appreciated.